Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Articulations, a podcast by ITERARTE. My name is Laura Egerton, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Tamara Chalabi to discuss her latest exhibition, Beneath the Gaze of the Palms, which she co-curated in Riyadh in December 2024 as part of Common Grounds Festival, organised by the Saudi Ministry of Culture. So Tamara, can we start off by you telling us a little bit about where this exhibition began?
Hi, Laura. Yes, this exhibition began within the context of cultural diplomacy within this festival that you mentioned, Common Grounds. That's something the kingdom, the Ministry of Culture in Saudi has launched to kind of celebrate Saudi in the context of its neighbors. This specific edition with Iraq was very important for both countries and for setting the right tone because of the shared borders, but also the endless connections over millennia, actually. And particularly a project that has been in the making under auspices of the UNESCO called Darb Zubaydah, a trail established during the Abbasid period in the 8th century AD. Pilgrimage route from Baghdad to Mecca. Even though the exhibition was not uniquely dedicated to this route played a very big role in the way that we shaped the exhibition and the themes around which the exhibition was developed.
Wonderful. And you worked with Jemana Guth as a co-curator commissioned by the Ministry of Culture. So did you each brought artists that you've worked with previously, a combination of works from the Ibrahimi collection as well as new commissions?
It was a wonderful collaboration with Jumana, who was handling the Saudi part. It was a constant conversation reflective of the overall story between Iraq and Saudi in terms of the positivities, but also the challenges. We had many challenges, but the main one was the fact that this show was taking place in a space that we had to design and build. It wasn't being shown in an existing space, which was interesting and challenging because we're talking about a massive space the size of 2 football pitches. And so the idea of this grandiosity of the space, as well as trying to decide on the suitability of the works, and most importantly, thematically, how this was going to work out. We decided on a series of themes which guided us in the selection of the artists and the works. Dealing with the Iraqi part presented a different set of challenges than with Saudis. With Iraq, given its turbulent and rich history, you have artists who are in the diaspora, you have a whole body of work of modernists, hence reaching out to the Ibrahimi collection because they have an interesting body of that, plus artists from within Iraq, the different artistic cultures. At the end of the day, the experiences are very, very different. I mean, there is no proper ecosystem within the Iraqi context to support artists and help them in the last 40, 50 years, whereas Saudi has a very different approach. Artists in Saudi can't keep up with the amount of attention and shows that their ministry is providing them as a platform. And so it's a very different reality. The Iraqi artistic scene, I would say, is older in the sense that the whole interaction with modernism started much, much earlier, and I would say a few decades earlier. And it's just a very different approach. And so that was challenging, but challenging in a good way for me. I was very interested in exploring the themes. And these were basically 7 themes that we worked on.
Just to go back to those modernists as well, I think it's fascinating when you look back historically, how there was movement between the two nations. There are artists who were teachers from Iraq who came to Saudi. Many of them are friends and collaborators, despite their distinctive sort of nationhood in a sense. There is there's also been many exhibitions in Saudi uncovering Saudi modernists who maybe haven't been known, that generation.
In Iraq, you had artists who were studying in the Slade in London and the Beaux-Arts in Paris in the 1920s. It's an interesting way of looking at time and the evolution of nationhood and how the works of these artists reflected that. And of course, in the context of Iraq at the time, historically, there is a lot more figuration because it was part of a whole experimental scene. In the Saudi case, considering Islam and the state, there's a much more abstraction, if you like, and things that are not really explored for a variety of reasons that provide a very different aesthetic, interestingly.
And so you selected were kind of intentionally quite universal, right? I mean, tackling very much kind of identity, heritage, nature, the land and water.
I think they're always very relevant. I'm quite fond of universal themes because I think they're multi-layered and you can unpick a lot out of that. Within this context, we had 7 themes. As you mentioned, there was heritage and identity. There was the pioneers, the modernists, and that was very much in connection with the experience of both countries, like discovery of oil and their relationship within the 20th century and modernization. We talked about land and water as very organic elements that are a fundamental conversation in both countries, whether it's about lack of water or flooding, whether it's about desertification. There's so many angles to it. And then it continued into the inner self, or the inner world and the self, which was more autobiographical. Artists who were more concerned with their own kind of trajectory and identity rather than a larger national one. We had movement and migration, a fascinating topic that deserves a lot more exploration. We had everyday life, which is interesting, and how that's practiced and communicated among different artists of different generations from both countries.
Can you tell us about the entry point that you chose to create for the exhibition under a motif, how this was an important reference point to the community and the link between art and architecture?
Yeah, it seems really interesting to incorporate something of the larger concept of identity and heritage from the context of a motif, which is a very particular and unique structure that goes back to Sumerian times, that is still a living thing, meaning people still build them and live in them in the marshes. They're made entirely of reed from the marshlands of Iraq, propped in water. And I found this to be really interesting in the context of the fact that it's one of the structures that is referred to as low-tech architecture. In the context of environmentalism and ecological sustainability, I really thought it fit into the larger conversation. This was a very ambitious project to have embraced in the short time we had to do this show, because it required a whole team of builders, artisans from the marshlands to prepare this structure in Iraq. It requires a lot of preparation, and to come by land from the marshes near Nasiriyah all the way to Riyadh in order to construct it on site in a very different terrain. The floors are concrete, you can't drill into them. So having to find the innovation of how you would make this work, which it did. And we had a beautiful structure that people were invited. It was the entry point of the entire show. So it kind of set a certain tone.
And it connects to the idea of the Majlis as a place of gathering.
Absolutely. We, as a place of gathering, but also being something relatable also in Saudi, even though that marshland ecosystem doesn't exist. I mean, there's something very archaic about it. It's incredibly connected to nature. It is made out of nature, and it is a structure entirely held together with natural elements. I think these are very important points. So this journey of discovery that many Saudi artists are undertaking is fascinating and has an anthropological angle. There are so many elements we're not completely familiar with that are reflective of the Saudi flora and fauna, and things outside the cities in different areas of Saudi that are quite varied. So I thought it's an interesting way to introduce the whole show through that.
So let's dwell as well on the kind of poetic nature of the title of the exhibition, Beneath the Gaze of the Palms, which of course does immediately reference the shared climates and elements of nature across the two nations. How did you come up with this title?
I'm a big fan of the palm tree. I love palms. I find them so poetic and majestic. My exposure to them has been mostly in Iraq, seeing places that feel like they stopped in time. You have like these sort of very lush palm forests, if you like, which kind of seems anachronistic with the idea of palms and desert and so on. And sort of the lushness I find fascinating, but also beautiful to look at and to be kind of walking through. And there's a story about one particular palm, which is called the Barhi palm, which is a type of palm tree much valued in Saudi, and actually came from Basra in the 19th century through trade. A merchant brought this palm and has a lot of value. And in fact, it's kind of a protected type of fauna that you can't just cut down. I thought that was an interesting point of connection. There's something very poetic about the palm tree because it's one of the taller trees that exist out there. The idea you would have it be almost like a conduit between the skies, the celestial world and the earthly world. And, it's rooted in the earth, but then it kind of like speaks to the skies. So it just felt a very apt title for this particular exhibition, but also like as also homage to, in a way, something that we see probably daily. I mean, it's part of the Saudi government insignia. It was a good way to emphasize the commonality and the shared sky.
Yes, and the permanence of the sky and the earth and the permanence
absolutely
of continuity of that. But it's also kind of suggestive of shade, isn't it, on shelter as well?
Yes, it's the idea that not only does it inspire you, feed you, it protects you,
nurtures,
and nurtures you, and it has its ways. I'm not the best expert on the different uses of the palm tree and the fronds, but there are so many elements to the palm tree that go beyond just the dates. The creativity over millennia of how the different parts of the palm tree have been used.
The evolution of the palm, we've seen it at the Islamic Biennale in Jeddah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think incredible. And so,
I think it is a fascinating strand of contemporary art practice, looking at this human-non-human relationship, this symbiotic relationship that can be developed, how we can have that duality between what's around us, what's been there for generations, and how humans have penetrated that and how they can use it for contemplation, for shelter, for sustenance. Exactly.
In reference to that, Laura, what was really interesting was a moment when at some point in the second room, which is where the modernists were housed, both Saudi and Iraqi, I was very worried about the way that the space was going to shape up because it felt that there was so much to absorb. I thought it would be a good idea to have an area where people could sit, rest, and contemplate in a salon-like environment. Reflective of the whole modernist era. And so we decided that it would be best to potentially have a real living palm tree in the middle of this space. And talking about, the ceilings are so high, it's like a hanger. And it was a very humbling moment when the palm trees, because there were 3, were brought in by the palm sellers to install in this space. Suddenly this very ancient world opened up where you had these guys climbing up the trees to balance the tree and push it down to be rooted. A whole different element of society appeared within this contemporary art exhibition. It was dramatic. People were moving quickly. There was a lot of concern about stabilizing them, but also they were so big. And just for me, the contrast between the human size and the palm tree size and how so many men were needed to position it and so on. It was like one of the most delightful moments of the show.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's so fascinating how we feel, particularly in this region, there's conflicts between humans, but the balance of power with nature is really vital and very close to the work that is on show as well. Maybe we could consider some of the commissions you made with Iraqi artists and talk through some of those. So the title for me is very resonant of Adel Abedin's, for example, They Were Here. I think it's again talking about this notion of time, which is something we talk about a lot at ITERARTE. Do you want to talk us through some of the...
Yeah, absolutely. I think Adel's commission was one of the most ambitious and challenging to install in that space. I was happy that he accepted the invitation to participate. And although this was a project that he was developing prior to the show, it kind of expanded in terms of the work that was going to be shown. And then we had conversations, curatorially speaking, and there was a lot of bouncing back of ideas. And Adel's proposition is very much about the whole notion of time, but time across millennia. They Were Here as a multimedia installation, a philosophical meditation on the passage of time across millennia. And it's rather existential in the sense that the entire installation, which is composed of film, sculpture, is built around this object called the Standard of Ur, which is from the Sumerian era in Iraq, going back to 2,600 years BC, and is one of the key artifacts of the Sumerian period at the British Museum. And Adel basically recreated a copy of that with a mosaic artist in Jordan. It's the size of a rectangle with 2 large surfaces on each side. And whereas the original had on both sides figures, the whole idea of the standard is connected to peace and war and is a meditation on the nature of man. And in Adel's case, he actually made the copy of it. So he depopulated it so that the figures in the original standard were spread across this very large table, walking through time. entering into the film, being shown above the table. It was extremely poetic. In the film, you have the image of a tailor making small clothes, a marker of how clothes reflect the change of identity. We are the same creatures, but with about 5,000 years apart, of how we change in our surroundings and the things that contain us. There were so many layers to this work that I thought was rather beautiful, and it's very interesting to work with Adil. He's extremely professional and exacting. This was a very last minute show in a sense, and there was, interesting challenges to overcome.
Of course, yes. And that representation of artists who are displaced, who live in the West, yet they still have that resonance and connection with the homeland. I mean,
Absolutely, and it sort of very much fit into the theme of movement and migration, which was, as I said, one of the more important, at least for me. I resonated a lot with that theme.
The idea of a journey is very central to our philosophies of
very much. The other work that I really enjoyed commissioning was the work of Fahar Saleh, an artist currently based in Germany. It was called The Cage. The work was made up of roughly 650 handmade bird cages specific to the nightingale, which in Arabic is called the bulbul. And we actually ordered these cages to be made by this family in Baghdad, in one of the outskirts of Baghdad. These cages are made from palm fronds. They built 650 cages in record time that we then had to ship by land across Iraq into Saudi, where then they were installed on a metal structure that the artists had designed to reflect the idea of the cage as kind of like a more symbolic, presentation of freedom, of the idea of like to invite a human to enter into a cage made up of bird cages and reverse the roles. Also as a homage to certain elements within Iraqi history and folklore. When Radio Baghdad was set up in 1936, the first sound played on the radio was the song of the nightingale. It became a tradition. So every morning when Radio Baghdad opened, the first sound you heard was that of the nightingale. So there's so many different elements of I think it resonated with a lot of people and different experiences. For him, there was also a connection with the feeling of being imprisoned in a place like where you can't leave because you don't have the right papers or the passport, etc. When you may want to leave, as has been the case during the war in Iraq. Or the idea of us being, prisoners of our own issues, of our own selves, etc. So again, many layers to it that I enjoyed discovering.
I love that connection to sound and how that can permeate and go beyond the physical entrapments and traverse across borders and have a real kind of impact.
And I think we saw that more recently in the Sharjah Biennale opening, and how the use of sound was democratic and sort of unifying. It really is in a way borderless, and despite the fact that we have different kinds of sounds and all sorts of categorizations, that it's something that sort of transcends all of it, because there's no filter. It just goes into your ear and then you have to process it.
When you're connecting it to time as well, it is by its very nature temporal and ephemeral. Like you say, the nature of the repetition of having the same sound every day on the radio, there can be that sense of repetition and order and structure in kind of timekeeping and in connections.
Yes, but also the fact that the sound of the nightingale sounds the same. I mean, you can have a nightingale today and they would be singing the same. Also eternal in a way.
Which, as societies change, you can still connect to.
Kind of something rooting.
And there was other soundscapes created by other artists. Asma Al-Isa, looking at the technical.
Asma Al-Isa was a commissioned work that I really enjoyed collaborating with her on. Asma was open-minded to expand on a project that she'd done and be receptive to certain ideas and suggestions. It was a reconstructed garden that we actually built in the space. She was part of the theme of land and water. That shaped the internal garden. She took the outline of the botanical garden in Baghdad, a lovely place, somewhat forgotten in the context of everything going on, and which was set up in the early 1920s, and has played a very interesting role over the years in kind of like preserving the indigenous plants and seeds of Iraq. But I just thought it would be interesting to reconnect again with, she used the botanical garden as a place of reference and selected specific plants that were unique or particular to Iraq and had existed back in Mesopotamian times. Then she did a recording of the sound of the birds in the actual botanical garden in Baghdad. It was kind of also an invitation to sit. We had these benches and to sit and kind of contemplate, enjoy the flora, listen to the sound, and be transported to another era.
Yeah, I think going back, I'd love to talk briefly about your own personal heritage, the displacement of your family from Baghdad in the 20th century, and this yearning and nostalgia for these spaces, and how that is a resonant theme throughout Iraqi artists. Given that the history of warfare, these dualities between peace and war, and finding some sense of peace individually.
I would probably argue that I'm still dealing with displacement. My other half is Lebanese, and we've had a very challenging year with everything going on in Lebanon and the war. We're still living very much in displacement. Maybe it is kind of rooted from my own experiences, both inherited and ones that I've lived through. This idea of movement and displacement. But I think it's just a very interesting concept because there's so many different definitions of displacement. One is obviously about loss and movement, disconnection, but also psychological states. We are displaced because of so many things, let's say war and violence, whether it's ecological, whether it's simply the passage of time and modernization, whether it's technology, what open-ended, ongoing subject that can be explored in so many different ways universally. I'm really interested in that. And I just think there's so much in it. In the context, going back to this show, there were so many layers to it. Although I was joking a lot with Jumana Rauf, my co-curator, about the difference between the Saudi and the Iraqi artists. Even the very dramatic changes that are taking place in Saudi Arabia as far as this Vision 2030 and many different societal changes also cause a form of displacement in people in terms of their perceptions and their need to adapt and how they respond to things, obviously from a creative, artistic perspective. So it's very relevant. For me, the whole idea of Mecca as the pivotal point of pilgrimage for the Islamic world and the constant wave of movement and displacement. It's a little bit different in Iraq, but in Iraq, you also have many different shrines. It's a very important place of pilgrimage where people go to purify, to worship, to practice devotion, which is a whole other angle as well. From that, you have so many offshoots that translate differently.
Absolutely. Baghdad is a center of learning for millennia, connecting to early writing and books and that whole culture of gathering knowledge.
Yes, and how that knowledge moved and was dissimulated and the transmission of it. Rediscovery of Greek texts that were then translated to Arabic, that were then, diffused to the West, and just so many elements existed and we talk about them, but you have very tenuous connections today that you see in the form of a manuscript or an archaeological site that is almost disappearing. And the fact that we still talk about it, that it's so relevant and it appears sort of again and again in different ways. So this is one of the elements I was very pleased about because we had one section in the exhibition that Jumana particularly did most of the work on because it was to do with the dead Zubaydah. It didn't really involve contemporary art per se, but it was designed by a very interesting architectural studio in Riyadh called Studio Bound. And so it was the recreation of the route, focusing on the wells, the resting points, etc., and the different archaeology that has been uncovered. I was really happy that I could contribute, at least from the Iraqi side, with certain manuscripts of pilgrims from that period that exist at the Iraqi manuscript house in Baghdad, which has a very rich collection that is underexposed.
I love the use of the term roots, because when you're going back to nature, to the palms, this is what's permeating and spreading between the two nations. Congratulations, Tamara. What an achievement. What do you feel the impact of this exhibition is going to be on the global scenes or, specifically?
I think, to be honest, I think that this kind of exhibition speaks to a wider audience. It's not just about being Saudi or Iraqi, because, there's so many trade routes in that area. And I mean, they all at some point interconnect. So even this route connects with the route that they call the Levantine route that comes through Syria, routes that come through the east via Iran into Baghdad, the routes that connected to the spice route in the Arabian Peninsula. For me, this is the beginning of a larger project exploring the connections between heritage and contemporary art, because I think it creates a very interesting conversation and opens up many different worlds that are otherwise unexplored, and has a very interesting local agency to it. By engaging with artists from the areas, you're creating a different kind of conversation and having a traveler coming and reporting on what he's seen locally. I think it opens up a whole new way of exhibition subjects, but also of different kinds of collaborations that are much needed.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, in many senses, it's timeless, but also very specific in its sense as well. But thank you so much, Tamara.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk.
Bye.